Hello. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm Bloomberg's labor reporter, Josh Eidelson. I'm grateful to Wilma and to everyone at Lyra and to all of you for making this conversation happen. Over the past 15 months, the COVID-19 pandemic has, at least temporarily, remade US workplaces in real time, ballooning some sectors of the economy while paralyzing others, transforming where and how people do their jobs, and exposing a big swath of the workforce to new, deadly, and unequal risk. It's also rewired how we talk about work here in the United States, casting a harsh spotlight on some provocative, interconnected things about US work. These include corporate discretion about whether to provide perks like paid sick days, an unusually stingy safety net that makes people particularly dependent on their jobs, an outlier at-will employment regime that means people can lose their job for almost any reason or for no reason, limited legal remedies for people allegedly punished for trying to improve their jobs, and narrow definitions of employment that exclude a lot of workers from a lot of workplace law. COVID-19 has transformed the conversation about these things, and it's inspired organizing and legislative efforts to tackle them. What we don't yet know is to what extent it will lead to lasting fundamental change. To probe that question and what workers, executives, and lawmakers are doing to address it, I'm delighted to have this august panel assembled. You can read their extensive bios online, but in very short terms, Heidi Shierholz is Policy Director for the Economic Policy Institute and the former Chief Economist for the US Department of Labor. Marshall Babson is an attorney representing employers at Seyfarth and a former member of the National Labor Relations Board. Janice is Research and Strategy Director at Rutgers Center for Innovation and Worker Organization and a former organizer. Juliana Feliciano Reyes is an investigative reporter who's been on the labor beat at the Philadelphia Inquirer and was a winner of last year's Lyra Media Award. We are aspiring to make this a majority Q&A discussion. So each of our panelists will begin with brief 5-minute remarks. As they do, please feel free to begin putting your questions in the chat. Thank you so much, and over to you, Heidi.
All right, I'll start and try to keep it short. So this is a great panel. I'm honored to be on it. Thank you for inviting me. And when I saw the title, I should say that whenever I hear talk about a recession changing anything permanently, I sort of tense up a little bit. And so I'll give you a little bit about why I tense up a bit about that. So in the aftermath of every recession, there is just a great tendency to think things are fundamentally changed. There is a new normal. What's going to be different now is one of the most common questions I get after a recession. And I have to say, typically the answer is probably not that much, at least not as a direct result of the recession. So when a recession hits and jobs are lost, the jobs that come back tend to look pretty much like the ones that were lost. So there's always long run structural change, and that continues. So not everything will be exactly the same, but those structural changes evolve pretty slowly, and not that many changes occur as a direct result of the recession. So one way to think about this is sitting in 2019, 10 years after the end of the Great Recession, if you tried to think of 3 or 4 things in the labor market that were fundamentally different because of the Great Recession, it's actually pretty hard. And I expect that to be the same this time around too, unless, and this is key, this is the kind of the main point I want to make, that will be the same here too, unless COVID and the recession lead to fundamental policy changes. And so before I get into that, I just want to say that I actually think that even without policy changes, there will be more fundamental changes as a result of the COVID recession than we typically see in normal recessions, because I think this is the key thing. There will likely be an increase in white collar telework that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And that will have effects like reducing business travel, which will have a big effects on jobs around hotels and transportations. It will mean there will be lunch places that may shift from city centers to other areas, but I don't think it will be a sweeping effect relative to the whole economy. And to put some numbers on it, according to BLS, During the worst of the pandemic last spring, 35% of workers reported that they had teleworked as a result of COVID, but that has been really steadily coming down over the last year. And as of last month, it was only 16.6%. I think I think that's going to be higher than what we'll ultimately see, because there are still a ton of white collar workplaces where people are still teleworking as a result of COVID, but that will reopen later this year. So I think the ultimate effect will be even less than that 16.6%. So we will see a change, but not a sweeping change. And then one thing I want to add on that is, whatever the size of the change in telework, it will increase inequality in terms of job quality. Teleworking is a perk in most cases, and increased telework as a result of the recession will be going to people who already have the highest quality jobs. Okay, what about other kinds of worker power? So one thing we're seeing right now is there is a ton of talk about worker shortages and the possibility that that is increasing worker power. You're seeing headlines everywhere about this. There was a headline in the New York Times yesterday that was, with US employers eager to hire, job seekers have the most leverage in years. I have to admit, I think there is a lot less to this than meets the eye. In the aftermath of every recession, there is always a period where there's a bunch of frenzied, breathless talk about employers not being able to find the workers that they need. We are certainly hearing that now. But when you look deeper into the data, it's not even close to as pervasive as the reports are saying. So, for example, right now, we're hearing a ton of talk about worker shortages in restaurants. And just to step back a little, labor shortages are identified by accelerating wage growth. If an employer can't find the workers they need, they raise wages to poach them from other workers, who will then raise wages to retain their workers, and so on. In restaurants and bars, we have seen substantial wage increases, but those wages are still really low. The current weekly wage for typical workers in leisure and hospitality, which is the sector where restaurants are, that current weekly wage translates into annual earnings of less than $21,000. And these wages plummeted in the recession, and the recent increase has done little more than just restore them to where they'd be if COVID hadn't happened. And these wages, the data on these wages includes tips. So the huge decline in restaurant wages earlier in the pandemic and then the recent rebound, it may have a lot less to do with employers cutting wages early on and then raising them up right now because workers have so much leverage. It may have a lot less to do with that and a lot more to do with the fact that customers directly pay a large share of workers' earnings in the form of tips, and customers left, but now they and their tips are coming back. So all this says I don't really see a huge increase in worker leverage here, again, unless we have policy change. I'll say one thing about this, when I look at the recovery, I'm super optimistic about job growth. With the vaccine and wide distribution, with the fiscal support from Relief and Recovery Act, I think jobs are going to continue to grow really strongly, but that does not mean there'll be good jobs. It does not mean that workers will have more power. I think a key thing is you only have to look at the last couple of years before COVID hit. We got down to a 3.5% unemployment rate, and wages for working people were growing, but not that strongly. So just to sort of bring it back, in order to see strong pay increases for working people and increases in worker power, we need sweeping policy change. We need to see minimum wage increases. We need to mandate paid sick leave. We need to pass the PRO Act. The PRO Act is the legislation that will make it much more possible for workers who want to join a union to be able to do that. We need to crack down on employers who misclassify workers as independent contractors. So that's what we need to do. The question is, do I think this will happen? Some of these things are happening at the state and local level. That's fantastic. But at the federal level, they're on pretty shaky ground. A lot of these policies have passed through the House. The minimum wage has passed through the House, the PRO Act, but it's the story we're all very familiar with. They have stalled in the Senate. It's a massive roadblock, and we can all count the votes. The votes aren't there for labor law reform. And it's really the same. Yeah, Josh, yes, I got your chat. I'll wrap up right now. I'll just say, absent filibuster reform, we are not going to see the permanent changes in policies that will support strong increases in pay and job quality for working people. So in a key way, the question the title of this panel poses, will COVID-19 change US labor management relations for good? In my mind, a lot of it comes down to whether it leads to the kind of organizing that will make filibuster reform possible. Sorry for going over.
Thank you very much. Marshall?
Thank you. Thank you to my co-panelists, people who have been kind enough to sign in today. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'd like to make a couple of general observations based on my practice that are quite particular with regard to unionized employers, and we'll just talk about employers generally. And then perhaps a couple of moments to discuss policy, as Heidi has suggested, that is so important. So first of all, with regard to unionized employers.
Marshall, I think there's an audio challenge. Are you able to, I'm not a Lyra audio expert, but are you able to log out and in, or to switch?
Yeah, I just turned it off and turned it back on again. Is that better or no?
You might have to completely leave the session and come back. Like sometimes reconnecting to Zoom can fix the audio issue.
And is everyone else muted also?
I'm hearing some background noise.
Yeah, you might.
It's probably from me with the background noise, and I'll remute myself, but we're having quite a bad echo feedback from yours every time you talk.
Do you have another?
Let me leave and come back. Okay. I'll leave and come back.
Josh wants to move to the next person.
Sure. Thank you. Sorry for the difficulty. Janice, please take it away.
Yeah, okay. First of all, let me just say, I think Lyra this year has been fantastic. Big kudos to Wilma Liebman, and also what a pleasure it is to be on a panel with Heidi Shierholz, who's one of my Sheros, and a plug for her op-ed that was in the New York Times. Was it today, Heidi, or yesterday, or when was it?
This morning. Yeah.
This morning, right. So hot off the presses, I guess we used to say that. I don't know if we're still allowed to. And to Josh, who actually won the media award, the Lyra Media Award last year or the year before. Yeah. Anyway, so I'll just say I stipulate to absolutely everything Heidi just said. And so I think what I'll do is try to talk about things that Heidi didn't say that, maybe can add to the conversation. I guess I do want to say, at the risk of sounding Pollyanna-ish, that I agree with Heidi that nothing changes without organizing, and that we're really stuck with the structural problem of the US Senate. And so if we only consider passage of the PRO Act or, federal legislation, she's quite correct. But the thing that I guess has given me the most hope in the last, period of time has been federal, what Michael Peoria and I have been calling, the labor federalism. Oh, he's back. Should I keep going, or should we keep going?
Yeah, keep going.
All right. So what Michael and I have been calling, labor federalism, right? All the amazing legislation that's been passed at the state and local level. And for all of you who are saying, yes, that's right, but what about preemption? Yes, preemption is terrible, and it means that we're limited in terms of which states and which localities we can pass paid sick and safe time, higher minimum wage, fair scheduling, ban the box, just cause, etc. But I think that there's been enormous hope that's been generated by, while we've been blocked at the federal level, there's been this huge upsurge at the state and local level, which, in political science is quite unusual, right? In general, the power asymmetry has always been viewed from the perspective of federalism as something that helps business or helps conservatives and doesn't help progressive legislating. But in this case, right, what we see is that there's been a lot of progress that's been made. So I'll just make a couple of very quick points. One, on the new federalism, although it is very encouraging, all of the legislation that's passing, and even with this, the stipulation of preemption, which must be dealt with. On the other hand, part of what Michael and I observe is that whereas the New Deal created a system that was nested in the economy, and created a way for worker organizations to gain power and to gain capacity to have some kind of power with and power over when needed be with employers. We're in a situation now where, unfortunately, right now, the policy stuff is kind of sitting in policy. It's sitting in politics. It's not, at least so far, leading to a system. And so part of what I'm interested in, and I know so many others who are writing about sectoral bargaining and, you know, who are looking at ways for independent contractors to organize, et cetera, is a way, can we create a system out of the new labor federalism? Can we create a system that kind of embeds and supports worker organizing, worker power, some bargaining, et cetera? So that's my first point. How am I doing on time, Josh?
You have another minute or two.
Okay, so then the other thing I would say is that there's a really exciting effort that's being made by the Essential Worker Organizing Collaborative, Jobs with Justice, a number of worker centers, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and a number of others to try to lift up essential workers as a permanent frame. And this started with the bill that was proposed by Elizabeth Warren and others around Essential Worker Bill of Rights, but there's a lot more to it. And one of them is trying to create worker councils, essential worker councils at the local level. So this question of whether essential worker could be a way of moving legislation at the state and local, obviously eventually the federal level, I think is very interesting. And one of the things that they've also been calling for is that similar to the huge efforts we're seeing being made by the federal government, and they've been calling for a lot of things to try to make sure that that comes to the workers who need it the most, workers of color, women, immigrant workers, et cetera. But the other thing is they're trying to figure out, how do we get a similar commitment from corporate America? You know, how do we ensure that corporate America compensates and acknowledges that it's made a huge amount of money over the pandemic, and that it needs to make certain commitments. So I'll leave it there. And as we go to the Q&A, we can talk more about that. I also wanted to say a quick shout out to Cornell, which has just done something really smart. ILR has created a strike tracker that goes beyond the BLS, which only looks at job actions of 1,000 workers or more. And lo and behold, what are they finding? Lots more action, right? Lots more action that they're recording. So I'm also very encouraged by the fact that we've got alt labor, unions are organizing, you know, there's a lot of activity, and we had a president who made a more pro-union remark than FDR. So I think these things matter, even if in this term, we can't do federal reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now if everyone could stay on mute for our moment of truth for Marshall's audio.
I don't know, is this any better?
Not so much.
This is exactly the laptop I've used for probably 20 other Zooms. I haven't had the problem. Any suggestions?
Maybe call in?
Somebody just raised a finger.
Yes, I think
I was going to look up the direct phone number and hand it to you so you don't have to find that. Give me just a second. Let me look it up.
Marshall, do you have another device on nearby that might be interfering?
No.
No?
No.
Shame.
I turned everything off, my other phones, everything, so there'd be no background.
Get closer to the computer, try that.
This is maybe a reminder of the limitations of telework that Heidi was alluding to. So
Any difference here?
really.
Does that sound any better, Josh?
It's still the same issue. Do you have a headset or?
I do not have a headset.
Okay, so it sounds like we'll be getting an audio line that you can call into. But in the meantime, maybe we should go to Juliana, and the anticipation for your remarks can continue to build.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to be the opener for the final act. So yeah. Actually, I think the timing for my remarks after Janice's sort of flow perfectly, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the local legislation that Philadelphia passed during the pandemic. So Philadelphia has been on this trend of passing these cutting edge worker protection laws. You know, before 2018, Philadelphia had some worker protection laws on the books, most notably paid sick leave, which went into effect in 2015, but took about 7 years to get passed. And if you compare that to the Fair Workweek law that passed in 2018, it took about a year to get passed. And so during the pandemic, we only saw an intensification of this trend. There was about a doubling of the worker protection laws on the books in Philadelphia during the pandemic. This was whistleblower protection. This was emergency paid sick leave, right to return, which basically gave seniority rights to workers who were laid off. And when it comes to if there's going to be a lasting impact with these laws, it varies. So some of these laws, like whistleblower protection and emergency paid sick leave, they're going to end when basically when the pandemic ends, or when these emergency health orders end, which in Philadelphia is already. But some of these laws, at least two of them, are permanent. And so I'm thinking about two laws that Unite Here, the Union Unite Here really lobbied for, and they essentially gave job security for hospitality workers, like hotel workers, in the event of an ownership change or in the event of outsourcing. And yeah, so they essentially give successorship clauses to these workers, which are really hard to win. And in terms of lasting impact there, it's also mixed because, you know, there's a lot of worker protection laws on the books in Philadelphia, but it really depends who knows about them, who knows about their rights. And we generally see that workers who are unionized know a lot more about their rights than workers who are not unionized. So there will also be like a mixed lasting impact there. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that how did these laws get passed so quickly during the pandemic? And I think there was a big narrative shift around workers, around essential workers, a lot more attention, a lot more sympathy for the plight of these workers. And, you know, is that last? I'm like, can any of that last? It's unclear. I think, you know, they're called narrative shifts for a reason. We've seen the tides like turn for how the public feels about workers. But I do think something that could last is maybe in certain workplaces where there was a really strong showing of worker power, perhaps that legacy might last. And so I'm thinking of an example at the Free Library of Philadelphia, where workers had been organizing even before the pandemic to oust their director, who they said had sort of overseen a culture of racial discrimination. And their organizing really got amplified during the pandemic and during the George Floyd protests. And they were able to oust their director and also their board chair. And it was a strong showing of worker power. And I wonder if that legacy will live on in terms of their labor management relations.
Thank you very much. And now, Marshall, if we can hear you by phone.
How does this sound?
Much better. Thank you so much for your patience with us.
Well, I only got 14 emails from you, Josh, during the time that I was trying to call in. Now, hopefully this will be helpful. So I'm getting some feedback on my end, but I'll ignore it. So very briefly, what have employers been seeing in the union sector? I would say that the short answer is an increased frequency of the obligation to bargain over conditions that are related to COVID. So as Harry Edwards in Milwaukee Spring 2 in the DC Circuit indicated, in the first instance, the language of the collective bargaining agreement applies. In the absence of applicable language, assuming that the topic or issue is a mandatory topic of bargaining, then there's a bargaining obligation. So I have spent a good deal of time in the last year plus bargaining on behalf of unionized employers with their collective bargaining representative over issues related to COVID. This has included safety measures, protective equipment, inspections and visitation by the union representative, expedited complaint avenues for individuals, and a whole additional array of issues that have arisen as a result of COVID. So from my perspective, with regard to unionized employers, the system is, for the most part, worked. There have been disagreements, there have been misunderstandings, but the number of cases truly in which either the union or the employer felt the need to resort to unfair labor practices in the NLRB have been, on balance, relatively few. And for me, this is a positive. And it indicates that, in fact, despite whatever difficulties or shortcomings the present collective bargaining regime may have, it can work in an appropriate circumstance when people understand their respective responsibilities. Now, with regard to the non-union sector generally, as the other speakers have noted, there have been a number of changes in the way people perform work. We're all familiar with this. And I think that the issue is how long-lasting, if any, these changes shall be. There's no question that telework, as Heidi indicated, for white-collar workers is going to be something that is, and see, with increased frequency. I can only use my own law firm as an example. We had a meeting a week or so ago to discuss what work would look like when restrictions ease. There was a large body of sentiment among professional employees, the lawyers, that they did not want to give up the additional time that they had gained in teleworking to being present in the office. So we can have an extended discussion about it, but I think all of us have a similar experience in understanding that work will be performed somewhat differently. It's going to be up to each individual employer to decide whether and to what extent he or she is willing to tolerate increased amounts of teleworking and absence from the workplace. And depending on where we sit or stand, as the case may be, we we may have varying views with regard to the benefits that accrue from working in a more collaborative, present environment. Just a couple of points, just very quickly, not to talk over my time. I understand entirely what Heidi has suggested with regard to policy changes. I think that it's clear beyond peradventure that with regard to many issues such as joint employer, independent contractor, that we badly need to revisit the way work is performed in 2021 so that we can make sure that our goals and aspirations align with the way that work should be performed. The PRO Act, however, I have to add, with all due respect to my colleagues, is not the answer. And I think from my perspective, the short description of the PRO Act is it's a disaster. We have a very carefully calibrated balance in our labor management relations now. If we believe that increased amounts of organizing are necessary, that's not a basis, it seems to me, to adopt fundamental changes that are at odds with the original goals and aspirations of this statute. So, for example, eliminating secondary boycotts, which in my view just means a proliferation of labor disputes to parties that are not involved in them, makes no sense. Just something as simple as giving the NLRB the right to engage in economic analysis under Section 4. Is that what we want? Do we want government adjudicators deciding whether or not an employer's decision to relocate his business was an economically sound or justified decision, or to cease doing business? There are a whole variety of business decisions. So we could spend the whole day talking about the PRO Act, but my respectful view is that that is a shortcut for people who are not willing to have a serious discussion on the fine-tuned adjustments that might be made with regard to worker classification and the issues that entails. And then the last comment I'll just make very briefly with regard to my colleague Janice's comments. I never have viewed, I respect, federalism, but I never viewed preemption as an enemy. Try to imagine companies doing business with 50 different regulatory environments. I don't think that's desirable. I don't think that's where we want to be as a country. We have to be able to strike a balance between national policy and local interests. And I think for the most part, not perfectly, we've been able to do that over the last 25 years. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Josh and others.
Thank you so much to each of you for your thoughtful comments and your patience with technical difficulties. A few of the themes that emerge here are the extent to which things can in fact go back to the way they were without conscious policy changes, the possible exception of telework as something that we may inevitably see at least a bit more of, the challenges in trying to pass federal legislation in an environment with a filibuster, and the hotter activity going on, for better or worse, at the city and state level, and then the limitations that federal labor law and other sorts of preemption create there. This question of narrative shift and who's considered an essential worker and whether people will continue to be thought of and to organize and demand attention in that way in the future. And the collective bargaining that we've seen going on in union shops in dealing with COVID that of course has not been going on in the rest of the economy on these issues. So with that, we have succeeded at saving almost half of our time for Q&A. The first of these questions comes from Michael Hillard, who says he's curious to hear from any of the speakers. If we were to get, say, 3 years of very low 3 or 3.5% unemployment starting this fall or winter, what do you speculate would happen for lower wage workers, especially workers of color who typically have high unemployment even when the economy has achieved full employment? What would this mean in terms of labor organizing and in terms of overall labor market adjustments? Is this something that one or two of the speakers would like to speak to?
I'd be happy to jump in and also to defer. Janice, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can start, and then you should definitely go. Well, I'll just say, Michael, we've been there before, and it didn't lead to revolutionary improvements, but it certainly helped, and it will help not just in terms of workers' wages, but it will definitely help in terms of labor violations, and that's in fact, part of what Heidi had to say. So I want her to talk about it. But the idea that somehow that in and of itself will be enough to really shift things, I think I would question, just because I feel like we've had low unemployment and we've still had structural racism, we've still had terrible occupational segregation. This, we've still had all kinds of gendered and racialized perversions in the labor market that haven't gone away, and we still have a whole lot of poor people and a whole lot of workers who are not earning enough money. So Heidi.
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry, I am off mute. That was exactly what I was going to say. Like, we sort of have been there, and we didn't. We saw some job growth or wage growth, and higher quality jobs just pre-COVID, but not anywhere near the kind of changes that we really need. And we were at extremely tight labor market. I mean, I think we could have gotten tighter if COVID hadn't hit, but so I totally agree with what Janice had to say. It is, I'll say one more thing on the importance of those tight labor markets, absent other policy changes, is that they do really matter for racial equality. EPI will be coming out with a paper soon, and we can figure out how to distribute it, but it's about, and others have talked about this, and so have we in the past, but just the importance to racial equity of high pressure labor markets. It just really matters. We know that tight labor markets, they sort of shift some power to workers from employers, because your employer knows if you can go around the corner and get another job, they have to actually pay you better to be able to retain you. So it does matter. And what it shows is that effect is stronger for Black and brown workers. And so it does have an impact on racial equity, but it's not enough. It's small. It won't do it. We do need actual policy changes. And I just want to make one response to Marshall, just a data response on the idea that you said that the balance that we have between say unions and employers right now is adequate. I think that balance is really not adequate. And one thing that I will point to is the vast difference between the workers who report they want to be in a union and workers who are actually in a union. There is just a gulf when workers are asked, would you vote for a union in your workplace tomorrow? It's right now, I should get these numbers, and I was trying to look for them and didn't find it, but I think roughly half of workers, non-union workers right now, say that they would vote for a union in their workplace tomorrow if they could. But the extremely low level of unionization that we have in this country just points to there's something else going on that is kind of undermining workers' rights to actually be in a union, that there's such a big gulf between what workers want and what they have. So I do think there's a huge amount of room for policy reform that will help balance the playing field a little bit.
Yeah, this is Marshall Babson. So what I would say, and there was another question about the balance. So I wasn't so much thinking about whether or not the entry into organization is finely calibrated. I think that we have rules on both sides with regard to organization. I think the most exquisite statement of what it is that the present entry system or choice system that we have appears in Justice Stevens' majority opinion in U.S. Chamber v. Brown, which on preemption grounds, Janice, struck down the California regulations that would have prohibited companies doing business with the state of California from spending California dollars on so-called anti-union speech. Even the dissenters in Brown, my old teacher, the late Justice Ginsburg, even she and others recognize in the dissent that there's at least the system that we have had in place since 1935 has been one, or at least since 1947, has been one in which we encourage full and free debate on both sides of the issue, the advantages and disadvantages. And so with regard to the studies that Heidi's talking about, I'm sure that that's the case. I've seen those numbers as well, but it doesn't take into account employees having heard both sides of the issue. And I'm somebody, I hasten to add, who believes in collective bargaining and believes that it works. Is it correct or the best at every location? That's for the individuals to decide. When I talk about calibration, I'm talking about the collective bargaining process itself. And the PRO Act, which will prohibit lockouts, for example, the hiring of permanent replacements, one can debate each one of these proposals, but I think that there's a fair discussion to be had as to whether or not the balance of economic weapons, these weapons that have been approved, so-called, to use a term that I don't like, but these so-called economic weapons that are part and parcel of collective bargaining today, these are weapons that have been described in positive terms by people like Justice Brennan and an American ship. He was a union lawyer in New Jersey. He approved lockouts, but we have a PRO Act which just throws it to the dustbin. So that's really what I'm talking about. I'm not really talking about the entry or exit from organizing. I'm really talking about the collective bargaining process itself, intermittent work stoppages, whether or not an employer should have the right to unilaterally implement his last best offer. These are things for those of us who've been bargaining for the last 40 years, have some familiarity with and understand the role they play.
All right, well, I guess I don't know. I mean, I guess we have to take on some of this, although I don't want to spend the whole time debating the PRO Act. I'll just say, to listen to you talk, it feels like I want to know where you've been the last 40 years when we've had this enormous mismatch between the power of corporations and employers and the power of workers. And as
I've been bargaining collective bargaining agreements. I know, but you've been
bargaining in a sector that's gotten.
Have you been bargaining collective bargaining agreements?
No, I haven't. I've been doing something else.
All right, so don't ask me what I've been doing. I've been bargaining collective bargaining agreements, and I've been advising employers of their obligations.
I'm sorry, you've already taken up a lot of time. Maybe it would be okay if other people spoke now. What I was going to say was that I'm saying that you've been in a sector that's been shrinking, right? The unionized sector. And what we're trying to address is the reasons why the unionized sector has shrunk so substantially, whereas firms have been able to continually morph and shift and respond to the changes in capital strategies. Unions have been stuck with 1930s labor law and a series of tactics that have become commonplace for employers to engage in. The symmetry that was built, the power kind of attempt at symmetry built in the Fair Labor Standards Act, certainly built into the National Labor Relations Act, although hurt by the Taft-Hartley Act, has been completely eviscerated now. So to hear you talk about how lockouts are okay, or that there's really not a problem and that secondary boycotts are a problem, it sounds like you're still thinking about the world as it was, not the world as it is and that workers are facing today. So it was not meant as an insult. I'm just saying, listening to you talk, it sounds like you're not addressing 21st century challenges for workers who want unions. Anyway,
that's just simply incorrect. With all due respect, why would one of the purposes of the National Labor Relations Act is to limit the impact of work stoppages, worker.
We're not having very many work stoppages.
One of the purposes of the statute is to limit the restrictions on interstate commerce. Why? How is allowing secondary boycotts? Maybe it makes unionization more effective, but how does that?
Have you been reading about?
How does that further?
How does that subcontracting and the fact that we've got all this, these very long supply chains and product chains that have made it really difficult for low-wage workers at the bottom to bring pressure to bear on their immediate employers because the power resides at the top of the supply chain? If you go to any LIRA panel, the word fissuring is everywhere, right? There's a problem with subcontracting.
The word fissuring, with all due respect to Mr. Weil, belongs in geology. It doesn't belong in labor law.
Okay, let's move on.
Having had that spirited discussion on that initial question, something that came up there and before is this issue of preemption and federalism. And Jake Rosenfeld asks a question for Janice, who I should note is also a professor at Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. He says, while I share your enthusiasm for all the state and local initiatives that build worker power and improve workers' lives, I do worry a bit about how this development coincides with another trend, rising regional inequality. Obviously, not all states are jumping in to fill the federal void when it comes to supporting workers. Do you have any optimistic case for them?
Okay, so Jake, I would answer with well, here's what I would say. I would say, first of all, this is not a substitute for action at the federal level. I would point to the Fight for 15, which has been very successful, and the raising of minimum wage, which has not just been confined, as you know, coming from Missouri, right? Not just been confined to blue states, not just been confined to certain progressive cities or counties or states. So I'd point to that minimum wage can travel, and also that the Fight for 15 has completely shifted the debate about minimum wage, and it is now being seriously considered. Again, we're stuck with the filibuster problem at the Senate, but the fact is these are reforms that sort of made their way from local to national. And there are other examples. You could argue that what was the most revolutionary about the legislation, the federal legislation during the pandemic has been, it's like it's woken up to gender and childcare and paid sick leave and caregiving and caretaking, right? That there's been kind of a shift in terms of an understanding about how backward this country is in terms of work-family issues. And then the other thing I would say to you, Jake, is I've been thinking a lot about the problem of the low percentage of labor regulation in the South and labor enforcement in the South, and what to do. And I think in part what needs to happen is there's so much capacity, so much potential for the federal government now to step in, right? And so the Wage and Hour Division and OSHA should think about, if you've got very, very low levels of regulation and very low levels of enforcement capacity, then the federal government needs to step in and fill that void in the South. So I'm excited about the kinds of things that the Biden administration is considering in terms of federal contracting, in terms of ways to support particularly those states where it's not possible to move this kind of legislation? Thanks for the question.
Another question is from Heather Grobe for Marshall. Referring to the discussion that's happened in unionized firms during COVID, she asks, will these improvements on the union side persist past COVID? Will there be permanent changes in collective bargaining agreements or collective bargaining relationships that come out of the COVID experience?
I think the answer is hopefully yes. We've had a couple of experiences already in which collective bargaining agreements have come up for renegotiation. We have reconfigured those collective bargaining agreements collaboratively with the union representative to take into account some of these fundamental issues that were not quite as apparent prior to COVID. And again, I'm not going to tell you that collective bargaining is a success in every instance, but there are notable examples in which that has happened, and it is my hope that it continues to happen.
Thank you. And there is still time for people to bring more questions. There are scholars who I will not call out by name here, whose questions I would be very curious to hear. In the meantime, another great question comes from Jeffrey Wheeler, who asks, if the PRO Act is not going to pass in its current form, is there some critical aspect of it that could in fact make it through and become federal law at this point? And he notes that what seems to be at the core of it is creating a situation where workers can more easily organize without retaliation or lengthy litigation. And I would take my moderator's privilege, given the back and forth we had on the PRO Act, to expand the question more broadly to also ask, is there federal legislation of any sort that we could see over the next months in response to COVID that could become law?
I'll just say that I think that that it's quite correct to say that retaliation is the biggest reason why workers don't organize. And it's also the biggest single reason why workers don't report wage theft and health and safety issues, et cetera. So I think retaliation, I think the whistleblower protections that people have talked about and that are in the Essential Worker Bill of Rights are super important. And again, I'll point to federal action, to executive action and as potential. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say for me, the secondary boycott thing is huge, but I agree that, politically, it's a whole other question. Yeah, thanks.
I can say a couple of things too. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about around the PRO Act, that one important thing it does is it provides a roadmap to a first contract. And I think that's a really important piece of this. There's also a crucial piece of this in that it cracks down on worker misclassification, which I think I couldn't, the politics of that are harder than some of the other pieces of this. But it bans right to work, states passing right to work. So it has a bunch of incredibly important pieces to it.
So let me just make a couple of observations with regard to remedies. This is an issue that's been discussed for quite some time. Of all the people who spent most of their careers, save my time at the NLRB, representing employers, I assure you, whether you believe it or not, that I'm not the most extreme person on this issue. With regard to remedies, I think this is a discussion that's been going on for quite some time, and if there were a constructive discussion to have with regard to putting more teeth into the remedies all the way around with regard to this statute, that's certainly a credible discussion to have. The point that Heidi just raised was certainly is an interesting and important one. the time to a collective bargaining agreement. The PRO Act would mandate for first contracts with interest arbitration. This is anathema to employers. Why is it anathema to employers? Because if you're selling your house and you're selling your house for $200,000 and somebody's offering you $100,000 and you can't decide between the two of you, and a disinterested third party comes along and says, you know, Mr. Babson, I know you're asking $200,000, but I think you should sell it for $150,000. That's what it's going to be. That's the way employers look at it. Now, that may be right and may be wrong, but interest arbitration has been anathema to U.S. employers for a very, very long time. And that's one of the reasons. Very quickly, with regard to the filibuster, I understand the issue. I have many frustrations myself with the inability of the Congress and particularly the Senate to get things done. But look at what happened when the Democrats did away with the filibuster with regard to judicial appointments. You know, this is something that Harry Reid was very proud of at the time. Since then, I don't know what the calculus would be, but we are certainly, for some people, looking at a court that might not look the same way had that deal not been made or struck. So we just have to be careful what we're wishing for. I can't see in the future entirely, but it's something that needs to be considered with some thought.
Thank you. As we get towards the end, I understand Brishan has a question for Heidi.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks everyone for this panel. Heidi, I wondered if you had any thoughts on whether, you know, totally with you on the labor shortage questions. I'm wondering though if you have any thoughts on whether we might see some kind of recomposition of the labor market in the wake of COVID, and, you know, what trends you see as most important and interesting there. A couple that I'll just point to, obviously, the gig economy is still a pretty small part of the overall economy, but it obviously has grown a lot under COVID. Restaurant employment seems to have shrunk, and maybe that was overdue in some ways because, you know, in a lot of cities, maybe there was restaurant overcapacity. I don't know, like there was some speculation about that, and it seems plausible to me anyway. And then beyond that, you know, I think we haven't been through the reopening of public schools around the country in earnest. And that's gonna, my kids go to DCPS and you know, they're gonna be in trailers because we have to open up more space, you know? So all of those have real job impacts. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts just, you know, on those or other ways in which we might see some reallocation of workers.
It is, so I still go back to the outside of, I think we will see reallocation because of white collar telework. Outside of that, it is, I think it won't be a ton, but there will be some. But one of the things, like with restaurants, over the last 2 months, 3/4 of the jobs that we have added in our economy have been in leisure and hospitality. Like it is just by far outpacing the growth rates in other sectors. And that's what we would expect because it saw the most losses, but still it's not showing signs of like, wow, this is not bouncing back. It definitely is. One thing I am deeply concerned about is we are still down 1.2 million state and local jobs. State and local governments just shed workers like crazy in the recession. They should be hiring them all back right now because of in the Relief and Recovery Act, they got a ton of relief. And I think there is some threat that they won't use that, or one thing we have to be concerned about is that them not using that ARP money to actually hire those workers back, but instead using it for something else. And that would be an absolute, that would be horrific. We will, in some ways, we won't know for sure until schools reopen more fully in the fall to see exactly where things are. But that is a reallocation that would be incredibly problematic if it happened, if we saw this reallocation away from state and local workforce.
Janice, I see you nodding in our final seconds. Is there more you want to say on this?
Oh, no, I mean, I just totally agree. It's a huge problem, particularly for women and people of color,
Yeah.
What's happened to the public sector. And, the one thing that I'll say is that a lot of the organizations across the country that have been working on this essential worker frame are trying to really get in there around how ARP money is distributed. I've come to really worry when I hear terms like shovel ready. And I think that the idea of ensuring that the ARP money goes to workers who really need it, and goes to programs and goes to opening up some of the doors that have been closed, particularly in workforce development, et cetera, is really important, and ensuring that undocumented workers who have been such an important part of the essential worker workforce have opportunity to be able to get some relief. So ARP is really, really essential. And I see campaigns happening all over the country by organizations trying to ensure that there's a just recovery and that that's where this money goes, and hiring back and also, ensuring that the money is not spent on paying bad debt, that states actually put the money to productive use in programs that support workers who have suffered so much from the pandemic.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our panelists. I will put my email in the chat. As a reporter, I must say, wherever you work, please bring me your stories. I cover all things workplace for Bloomberg News and Business Week. I'm grateful to each of our panelists and to everyone at LIRA. And it's a conversation that we will be continuing for a long time, including perhaps at LIRA again next year in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you.